It usually starts on a night like this. The streets are thinning out. The last buses are sighing their way back to the depot. And somewhere a television glow is the brightest light in the room. You hear distant traffic, a siren far away, and you settle in, get comfortable, listening to stories about monsters who walk through the same quiet hours you're trying to fall asleep in. On the surface, nothing is happening. Most people are scrolling, dozing off, or letting one more episode play. But in the background of our culture, there is always this low, steady hum of fascination with killers who pass for ordinary. This is the story of two of them, or at least, that is how the comparison is usually framed. Dexter Morgan on one side, the Zodiac killer on the other, like opposing players in a game that never actually existed. We are going to start with the easier one to hold in your mind. Dexter, a fictional blood spatter analyst at Miami Metro Homicide, walking into work under fluorescent lights, coffee in hand, a polite smile on his face. By day, he reads patterns in other people's blood, reconstructing violence with calm, clinical precision that makes him indispensable. And every single night, he goes home, opens his tools, wraps a room in plastic, and becomes the violence he spends his days dissecting. His life is built on contrast: sunny Miami days, family barbecues, donuts in the briefing room, then the ritualized nights, the table, the tape, the slides, the careful cleanup before dawn. Dexter's entire series is about how long a man like that can keep the mask in place when every moment of his routine brushes against the people whose job is to see through it. The Zodiac killer belongs to a different kind of night. Late 1960s, Northern California. Lovers' lanes, quiet roads, and then sudden, brutal interruptions that left bodies, shell casings, and questions. Instead of a plastic-wrapped kill room, there were letters, ciphers, newspaper headlines. A real, still unidentified murderer who wrote to the world and dared the police to catch him, then vanished into the historical record without an official name attached. When you lay them all out together, you start to see why people like to ask the same question. Who is scarier? Who is better at getting away with murder? Dexter, the meticulous insider with access to every lab report in Miami, or Zodiac, the taunting ghost who slipped through a much rougher pre-DNA system in San Francisco's shadow. But that framing is already tilting the board. One is a character whose close calls are designed by writers. The other is a real investigation, defined by human error and irreversible loss. Every season of Dexter bends reality to keep Morgan in play. The Zodiac case ends this. He is the person you might pass in a hallway and fail to remember 10 minutes later. Then the light changes. The same hands that bag evidence for the lab start taping down plastic sheeting, smoothing out the wrinkles along the edges of a kill room. There's a different kind of quiet here. Dexter lays out his tools in a straight line. Photographs, knives, duct tape, each object placed with the same calm precision he uses to label blood samples at work. The plastic wraps the walls, the floor, sometimes the victim themselves, until the whole space feels like a meditation chamber, built for one very final purpose. Every movement is rehearsed. Every breath is measured. What holds these two worlds together is a story Dexter was given as a child and never stopped telling himself. Harry's code. Only kill killers, never get caught, leave nothing behind. On the surface, it is a set of operational rules, a manual for surviving inside Miami Metro while quietly removing predators from the city. Underneath, It functions almost like a bedtime story, a script he repeats whenever doubt flickers. Harry wanted this. The code allows this. The monster is being aimed at the right people. The entire series is built on the friction between those soft days and surgical nights. Every season adds a little more pressure. Another person whose eyes linger a second too long. Another investigation that drifts dangerously close to Dexter's boat. His blood slides. His routine. A colleague notices a late arrival. A neighbor hears something in the middle of the night. A child asks a question that lands too close to the truth. Every close call, every near miss, every time the mask almost comes off, the line between the two lives thins. And yet, almost every time Dexter slips, the universe of the show bends. Evidence burns in a convenient fire. A different suspect appears at the right moment. Someone chooses love or denial over what is directly in front of them. When you lay them all out together, you start to see how protected Morgan really is, compared to a figure like the Zodiac, moving through a world with no writers, no reset, and no plastic sheeting waiting off screen. In the next section, let's put those two realities side by side and watch how quickly the comparison falls apart. So before we put Dexter and the Zodiac side by side, we're going to slow down and look at what the Zodiac actually was. Not a character arc, not a clean narrative, but a scattered trail across late 1960s Northern California. From December 1968 through 1969, and possibly into the early 1970s, someone moved between Vallejo, Benicia, Napa, and San Francisco, leaving behind at least 5 confirmed murders and a handful of other attacks that may or may not belong to the same hand. The confirmed timeline is surprisingly compact. A teenage couple shot in a parked car there's a call from a payphone to the police. A flat voice taking credit and reciting details only the killer should know. Then the letters begin. This is the story of someone who does not just kill and vanish, but writes to newspapers and law enforcement, sending pages of taunts, threats, and ciphers. The tone shifts between grandiose and petty, between claiming dozens of victims and obsessing over whether his symbols are printed on the front page. When you lay them all out together, you start to see a mix of arrogance and neediness, a person who wants control of the narrative so badly that he keeps handing investigators both potential leads and deliberate misdirection. But the world he moved through was not the world Dexter Morgan exploits at Miami Metro Homicide. There were no DNA databases quietly linking traces from one county to another, no digital surveillance catching a license plate 3 cities away, no standardized systems forcing agencies to share information in real time. The idea of a serial killer itself was only just entering public awareness, so police and press were learning the language of pattern and escalation as they went. What that leaves us with is not a case file that closes, but a fragmented record. Reports written by different hands, memories that change over decades, partial fingerprints, disputed handwriting, aging witnesses, and ciphers that still spark arguments online. Unlike Dexter, there is no season finale where the mask comes off, no final monologue that explains everything. There is only the outline of a person permanently out of frame. And in the next section, when we finally place that shadow beside Morgan's carefully scripted life, the gap between them becomes more unsettling than any reveal. And this is where the comparison starts to bend under its own weight. On one side, you have a shadow with no confirmed ending. On the other, you have Dexter Morgan, A character who literally cannot disappear for good until the writers decide the story is over. Dexter does not just evade Miami Metro homicide through talent or luck. He survives because the structure of a long-running television series requires him to. The network orders another season. The writer's room breaks another arc. And that means Morgan must still be alive, still free, still able to walk into work with coffee and donuts. If he is arrested in season 2, there is no Bay Harbor butcher investigation, no Trinity, no new blood. The mask cannot fall too early without collapsing the entire series. So, every close call is built with a safety net, a late confession, a conveniently timed explosion, a witness who dies, a colleague who chooses love or denial over evidence. These are not random miracles. They are narrative decisions and interviews that went nowhere. They are buried in case files instead of highlighted in a season finale. So when people ask who was better at avoiding capture, they are really comparing two different systems. One is a machine built for suspense, calibrated so that Dexter can stand at the edge of exposure, again and again, without ever quite falling. The other is a messy, real-time investigation, shaped by human fatigue, jurisdictional lines, and technology that lag decades behind what Morgan casually uses in the lab. Settle in, get comfortable, because in the next section, we are going to walk through Dexter's closest brushes with discovery one by one. And as we move from his carefully staged escapes to the Zodiac's unresolved reality, that rigged quality of the fight is only going to become harder to ignore. And underneath that rigged feeling is something a little quieter and a lot more personal, because the reason a Dexter versus Zodiac matchup exists at all is that late at night, when the world finally goes still, we're going to think about the ones who slipped away. You know that space between scrolling and sleep, where your brain starts replaying unsolved things. A missing person on a flyer you once saw, a grainy composite sketch, a voiceover about an unknown subject on a true crime documentary. This is the story of people who walked out of the frame and never came back in. The Zodiac is one of those shapes in the dark. Dexter Morgan is a safer, scripted version of the same shadow. Dexter gives you a killer you can actually follow home. You stand with him in the lab at Miami Metro Homicide. You watch him process evidence from scenes he secretly created. You listen to his narration explain why this victim deserved it, how Harry's code turns murder into a kind of twisted civic duty. He smiles. He brings donuts. He walks right past the detectives whose cases he is quietly editing. And because the series lets you live inside his head, you start to see every close call as a puzzle, every escape as a small, guilty relief. The fantasy is controlled, contained. Dexter's mask slips, but only as much as the writers allow in that season. When you lay them all out together, every moment he almost gets caught is designed to resolve, to click into place, to let you exhale and move on to the next episode. The Zodiac offers none of that, no narration, no code that limits the harm, just a faceless figure tied to real attacks in Northern California, real bodies, real families who never got an answer. Instead of plastic-wrapped rooms, there are open-air crime scenes. Instead of an inner monologue, there are taunting letters and ciphers mailed to newspapers, daring the world to keep looking and somehow never quite seeing enough. The open loop never closes. It just becomes part of history. How close Dexter comes to falling through them for good. So now we step into those gaps and notice something important. Dexter's close calls are not random accidents scattered across the series. They are the architecture of the show. Every season, almost without fail, is built around a hunter, a watcher, a threat whose entire narrative purpose is to drift closer and closer to the truth about Dexter Morgan. In the early years, it is Sergeant Doakes, orbiting him in the halls of Miami Metro Homicide, tailing his car, checking his rentals, prowling around the marina where Dexter keeps his boat. Later, it is Frank Lundy, whose quiet, methodical presence turns the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation into a slow tightening of the net. Then LaGuerta, who refuses to let the file stay closed. Then the FBI as an institution, with profiles that should, on paper, point straight at the forensics analyst in the lab. This is the story of escalation. Every close call, every near miss, every time the mask almost comes off, is designed to keep you watching. And that is where narrative armor enters the room. Narrative armor is the invisible protection wrapped around a main character because the story still needs them. It is the reason Dexter can make a reckless choice on a dock at midnight and somehow still walk into work the next morning with coffee and donuts. When you lay them all out together, you start to see how strong that armor really is. Doakes finds Dexter at the cabin with the plastic and the tools. Realistically, that should be the end of the line. Instead, Lila arrives, the cabin explodes, and the only body left to blame is the man who was right. The Bay Harbor Butcher case closes itself. Later, LaGuerta tracks down the old marina records, the blood slide, the connection to Doakes. She corners Dexter and Deborah in a shipyard. Another character appears. Another gun goes off, and the investigation dies with her. There are the smaller, quieter saves, too. A neighbor almost sees Dexter loading a body into his car, but gets distracted. A lab result that could incriminate him is delayed, contaminated, or conveniently overshadowed by a larger case. Missing time at a crime scene is brushed away because Morgan is the dependable one. The coincidences begin to stack. Now, let's hold that beside the Zodiac case. Out there is no narrative armor, no guarantee of a dramatic confrontation in a shipping yard, no promise that the person at the center will ever be named. There is only the slow grind of real investigation, limited budgets, exhausted detectives, aging witnesses, evidence that decays in boxes instead of exploding in cabins. So when people say, Dexter is smart, from there, we will move forward in order, through every major moment where someone has a reason to look twice at Morgan, and actually does. Every close call, every near miss, every time the mask almost came off. Each of those moments will be treated like a small case file. First, the setup, where Dexter is in his life, what his routine looks like, how stable the double life appears. Then, the suspicious character who finally sees something wrong, whether it is Doakes checking his rentals, Rita finding the shoe that should not be there, LaGuerta quietly following the algae. After that, the evidence itself, the thing on screen that would make any real investigator stop, and then the escalation. As tension builds, as Dexter improvises, as the line between exposure and escape narrows down to a single decision. Finally, we will watch the slip away. Not just the plot device that saves him, but the mechanism. Is it office politics that discredit a cop? Is it love that makes a partner look away? Is it a fire in a cabin that conveniently erases blood slides and bones? When you lay them all out together, you start to see how often the world of the series bends around Dexter to keep him moving. Periodically, we will pull back from Miami and look west to Northern California and the Zodiac case. After tracking a fictional dead end, we will compare it to a real one, a composite sketch that went nowhere, a partial fingerprint that never matched, a letter full of taunts that generated headlines but not handcuffs. We will place Dexter's carefully controlled kill rooms next to Zodiac's chaotic crime scenes and ask which one would actually be easier to solve. As we move toward the revival, we will keep a running, quiet tally. How many times should Dexter have been finished if the system around him behaved the way it pretends to? How many times should the Zodiac have been cornered if the tools and assumptions of modern forensics had existed in 1969? By the end, you will see a pattern emerge. A protected protagonist who survives because narrative demands it, and an unprotected killer who survives because the world was not yet ready to catch him. In the next section, let's begin that journey where it always starts, at the very first suspicion. Before we follow that first suspicion, let's pause for a moment on where you are right now. Maybe you are lying in bed, lights low, phone face down beside you, just letting the names and dates and scenes from Miami Metro Homicide drift past. Maybe you are working late, half focused on a spreadsheet, while Dexter and the Zodiac move quietly in the background, their stories becoming a kind of low, steady hum that keeps you company. This channel is built for that. We are going to move slowly on purpose. Instead of jump cuts and raised voices, you get long, unhurried storytelling about crime, fiction, and the strange places where they overlap. Choice that helps long-form, calm storytelling about killers and investigators and narrative masks continue to exist. You do not have to wake yourself up to do it. If your eyes are already heavy, you can let this play out and decide another time. These episodes will still be here. The only real difference is that if you subscribe, the next time we trace a line from a fictional crime scene in Miami to a real one in Northern California, it will quietly appear for you without you having to go looking. And there will not be any jarring interruptions waiting in the middle. No sudden volume spikes. No out-of-place comedy stingers. No abrupt breaks in tone. The goal is a steady, measured pace. The same way a good investigator walks a scene, one step at a time, careful not to disturb what is already there. Now, settle in, get comfortable again. Let's go back to the very beginning of Dexter's story, to the first people who looked at this polite, precise analyst and felt, for just a second, that something about him was not quite right. The first person who feels it is Deborah. She does not have the language for it yet, and the series is careful not to give it to her. What she has instead is proximity. She has grown up with Dexter Morgan, shared a house, a father, a set of stories about what happened in that shipping container and how it damaged him. She knows better than anyone at Miami Metro Homicide that his smile is something he puts on. Deb reads his distance as pain. When he does not react the way other people react, she fills in the gap with what Harry told them, that Dexter saw something so awful as a child that it shut part of him down. So when he is flat at a crime scene, when he is a little too composed around blood, she leans toward comfort rather than suspicion. This is the story of a sister who senses that something is wrong, but keeps translating it back into the only narrative she has been given. That misreading is important because it shows us how close you can stand to a monster and still miss the shape of the teeth, simply because you trust the person holding the flashlight. Deborah is intuitive, emotional, good at reading people, but her intuition keeps looping through the same explanation. Trauma, not predation. When you lay them all out together, the early scenes where she asks Dexter why he never really opens up start to look like near misses of a very different kind. Then the series gives us someone who does not love him. Sergeant James Doakes walks into Miami Metro like a tuning fork for danger. He has seen real violence, not just on lab slides, but in the field, and he recognizes the stillness that comes after you have crossed certain lines. Where Deb sees a wounded brother, Doakes sees a man who is too at home in the dark. From the beginning, Doakes is the first major character who simply does not buy. Zodiac investigation begins with a similar kind of almost knowing. Early officers and witnesses in Northern California have their own private lists of men who seem off, neighbors and coworkers who give them the same quiet chill Doakes feels around Dexter. But this time, there is no single protagonist, no central point of view to gather those impressions. The instincts get lost in paperwork, in jurisdictional lines, in the simple fact that the real world does not bend toward revelation the way a television series does. And yet, as we move forward, you start to see what happens when Doakes refuses to let that feeling go, and what it looks like when a real investigation, chasing a real killer like Zodiac, cannot quite do the same. That gap is where Harry's code lives on one side, and Zodiac's chaos lives on the other. And once you see the difference, the idea that they are the same kind of operator starts to fall apart. Harry's code is not really about morality. It is a risk management system disguised as ethics. Before Dexter ever wraps a room in plastic, he runs his own version of a background check. Case files, court records, patterns of unsolved bodies. He stalks, but quietly, for weeks or months if he has to, watching routines, checking for witnesses, cameras, unexpected variables. Every moment before the kill is about shrinking uncertainty until the victim is the only unpredictable element left. When you lay them all out together, the rituals look almost boring. The kill room, scouted in advance. The plastic sheeting, taped with methodical precision. The tools, laid out where he can reach them without turning his back. It is all about containment. Blood spatter stays on plastic, not drywall. Restraints stay hidden, not improvised. Even the way Morgan disposes of bodies from his boat is part of the same system. Deep water, consistent dumping grounds, a pattern that is invisible unless you already know where to look. This is the story of a man trying to erase his own existence from every crime scene he creates. Every close call in the series comes from the rare moment when that system falters, when a blood slide goes missing, or a camera he did not plan for catches a glimpse of his mask slipping. Zodiac, by contrast, builds his entire persona on the opposite instinct. Open-air shootings in parked cars, a broad daylight stabbing at Lake Berryessa with a hand-drawn symbol on his chest, phone calls to police, letters to newspapers. Instead of reducing variables, he multiplies them, inviting witnesses, reporters, entire cities into the story. The crime scene is not something he hides from. It is a stage he returns to in print. Those letters and ciphers are taunts, but they are also vulnerabilities. Handwriting. Phrase Dexter Morgan is not just any predator moving through a city. He is the blood spatter analyst who walks straight into Miami Metro homicide every morning, past the front desk, into the lab, and right up to the evidence. Settle in. Get comfortable with what that actually means. Every day, Dexter sees crime scene photos before most detectives have even finished their coffee. He watches bodies come in, reads lab reports, hears internal debates about timelines and suspects. When the team gathers around the whiteboard to map out a killer's pattern, he is literally helping draw the lines. This is the story of a man who does not have to guess how close the police are. He can measure it. And once you understand that, you start to see how tilted this comparison really is. Because that access lets Dexter preemptively adjust his behavior in a way no real-world killer could reliably manage. If a fiber report comes back strange, he knows what kind of fibers to avoid. If surveillance footage is mentioned in a briefing, he knows which streets to stay away from. He can plant a trace here, erase a trace there, and subtly nudge colleagues toward a different suspect, all while keeping his mask of helpful professionalism firmly in place. Now, let's contrast that with the Zodiac's world. In late 1960s California, even the police could barely talk to each other. Different jurisdictions held their own files, phone calls got lost, and there was no shared database quietly knitting patterns together in the background. The killer who mailed taunting letters and ciphers was exploiting chaos, yes, but he was also limited by it. He did not know which witness sketch had made it to which department, which fingerprint card had been misfiled, which lead was dead and which was still alive. Dexter, by design, lives in the opposite environment. Modern forensics surrounds him, DNA profiling, national databases like CODIS, digital surveillance on street corners and in doorbells, phone records that can place you on a bridge at midnight. He survives, not by pretending those tools do not exist, but by using his position inside the lab to dance between them. Every moment, he is both the person who understands how the net is woven and the person slipping through its holes. If the Zodiac had enjoyed that level of insider knowledge, if he had been the one quietly reading reports about himself, the story might look very different. But that only underscores the point. Dexter's situation is engineered, almost lovingly, to be survivable. When you lay them all out together, the advantages, the timing, the institutional blind spots, you're not watching a fair fight with history. You are watching a fantasy built inside a police station. And in the next part, we are going to see how even that fantasy eventually cracks from the inside out, because that fantasy does not exist in a vacuum. It is surrounded by a manhunt, a task force bulletin board that is slowly describing him. The profile says the butcher is organized, forensically skilled, likely an insider, almost certainly with access to a boat. The algae on the bodies lead straight toward his marina, and yet, every time the net tightens, he is there first, nudging evidence, adjusting a narrative, placing a bloodslide in Doakes' car, letting Lila's fire turn a cabin into a ready-made ending. The task force is not incompetent. That is important. They follow leads, coordinate resources, and close in with a kind of steady, procedural logic. But they are always one step behind a killer who hears their conversations, reads their reports, and can redesign a crime scene before they even process it. When you lay them all out together, the close calls in this arc feel less like failures of policing and more like the inevitable result of chasing a ghost who also prints the maps. Now, let's hold that up against the real Zodiac investigations. In Northern California, there was no single coherent hunt. There were city police departments, county sheriffs, and the state, all with partial files, different suspects, and no shared Dexter sitting in the lab to quietly unify the data. Ciphers went to newspapers. Letters taunted multiple jurisdictions. Priorities shifted as new crimes appeared and old ones went cold. This is the story of fragmented attention, not omniscient pursuit. Media pressure shapes both hunts, but in opposite directions. For Dexter, news coverage turns the Bay Harbor butcher into a dark folk hero, a whispered force cleaning up the streets, which only makes it harder for Miami Metro to see the monster at the next desk. For Zodiac, headlines amplify fear and generate thousands of tips, most of them useless, burying genuine leads under noise. One killer hides inside the system and benefits from its order. The other thrives in the chaos outside it. And when we are going to look closely at Dexter's closest calls, you start to see why the Bay Harbor Butcher season is where the illusion of safety in this series comes closest to snapping. The task force gets so near the truth that, for a few episodes, Dexter's mask is not just cracking. The entire narrative scaffolding around him is trembling. In the next part, we will follow those specific moments, step by step, and you may notice just how often the show has to bend its own rules to keep him alive. This is where the neat lines start to blur. Up to this point in the series, Dexter Morgan's double life feels strangely sustainable, almost elegant. But Season 1's ice truck killer case is the first time the investigation on the board at Miami Metro Homicide is not just close to him in a professional side, but fascinated. The intimacy is eerie because it is psychological before it is factual. The truth lands in his nervous system long before it hits the case file. Along the way, there are dozens of moments where his mask should slip. Dexter's lack of revulsion at the crime scenes, his quiet excitement when the killer escalates, the way his eyes light up at patterns in the blood that, officially, are not even there. Colleagues joke that he is weird. Deb calls him a robot. But nobody in Miami Metro Homicide stops long enough to ask why the blood guy is the only one who looks genuinely delighted by a serial killer with a flair for staging. The institutional blind spot is almost louder than Dexter's performance. When Rudy is finally revealed as Brian Moser, Dexter's brother, the danger is not just that the killer is in his orbit. It is that the case has dragged his origin story into the open. Deborah is kidnapped, the police are racing, and Dexter is suddenly standing in rooms where his composure should be impossible. Talking to the man who shares his trauma, hiding that connection from the woman who shares his life. He chooses Brian in private, then chooses Deborah in secret, and somehow walks back into the station with a story that holds. The emotional exposure is enormous, but the mask reasserts itself. Now, contrast that with Zodiac's early crimes. There, the emotional distance is almost total. Investigators do not know him. He does not know them. He sends letters, ciphers, public taunts. The scenes are bloody. The evidence is raw. But the connection is abstract. Dexter, by comparison, is already living inside a pressure cooker where the killer is his brother, his past, his reflection. Zodiac is an anonymous shadow. Brian is a mirror held inches from Dexter's face. Settle in, get comfortable, because as the seasons progress, that kind of intimacy between hunter and hunted becomes the rule rather than the exception. And the gap between a fictional killer like Dexter and a historical ghost like Zodiac only widens. That widening gap is most obvious when we follow Dexter into work. Because Miami Metro Homicide is not just his day job. It is the stage where the mask has to hold under fluorescent lights, coffee breath, and colleagues who know his rhythms a little too well. We are going to stay in those rooms for a moment. The briefing table, the lab bench, the taped-off perimeter where Dexter steps over blood that he already knows the story of. Again and again, he arrives at a crime scene with an uncanny calm, sometimes even before other techs, sometimes with a level of composure that does not quite fit the horror in front of him. People notice. A raised eyebrow from a uniform, a lingering look from Deb, a question in Doakes' silence that never makes it into the official report. And then there is Masuka, later points directly toward someone with Dexter's access and skills. She hesitates, not because the evidence is weak, but because the narrative is unthinkable. That the helpful blood guy could be the monster they are hunting. This is the story of how workplace relationships become armor. Office politics, friendships, reputations, shared late-night takeout in the lab, all of it creates a buffer around Dexter. To truly suspect him, a colleague would have to rewrite years of small kindnesses and private confidences, would have to admit that every donut he brought was delivered with blood on his hands. That is not just a professional leap. It is a psychological cliff. Now, let's break that frame for a second. Because when you lay them all out together, the Zodiac investigators did not have this problem in the same way. Most of the time, they were staring at case files, composites, and interview transcripts, not at a beloved coworker. Their suspects were names on paper or faces across a table, not the guy who fixed their printer and remembered their kids' birthdays. That distance can make you more objective, but it also makes you more limited. You see patterns in reports, not in how someone flinches at a joke or does not flinch at a body. You start to see why Dexter survives for so long. The same intimacy that makes him vulnerable also keeps him safe, at least until the people around him are finally willing to look past the mask and let the evidence touch their own lives. And that is where Sergeant James Doakes walks in like a stress test for Dexter Morgan's entire life. While everyone else at Miami Metro Homicide is soothed by the donuts and the awkward jokes, Doakes is the first person who simply refuses to be charmed. He looks at Dexter, and instantly, the mask does not work. From the very first season, we are going to watch his suspicion harden into obsession. He tails Dexter's car. He checks out his rental records. He appears in parking lots and hallways like a one-man internal affairs department, asking why the blood guy is always one step too close to the violence. Every moment that other characters treat as quirky, Doakes treats as evidence. You start to see it in the way he catalogs Dexter's emotional misses, the lack of reaction at particularly brutal scenes, the way Dexter lights up around blood patterns instead of flinching, the convenient absences, like when he slips away from Rita's to stalk a target, only to return with some thin explanation that does not quite fit the timeline. Doakes does not have proof yet, but he has a pattern, and that is enough to keep him circling. The series quietly stacks these encounters. Doakes catches Dexter at a crime scene he should not be near. He notices that Morgan is never truly surprised by a new body. He confronts him in the precinct gym, in the parking lot, out by the marina, pushing harder, laid out like a private museum of murder. It is the closest anyone in the series ever comes to fully, concretely knowing what Dexter is. For a brief, startling stretch of time, the predator is caged, and the hunter has done everything right. And then the narrative closes around Doakes instead. Lila blows up the cabin. The slides are used to brand him the Bay Harbor Butcher. Doakes dies as the almost hero of this story, the one man who saw too much, too early, and stood alone. Settle in, get comfortable, because the next person who gets this close will not be so easily erased. The cabin does not just burn, it disappears. 1 second, you have Doakes standing in the middle of the closest thing Miami Metro Homicide has ever had to a solved Bay Harbor butcher case. Plastic, tools, dismembered bodies, and Dexter Morgan's entire secret life arranged in a single incriminating tableau. The next second, Lila turns the gas, strikes the flame, and the whole structure becomes a white-hot correction to reality. The explosion is doing 2 jobs at once. In the story, it kills Doakes and incinerates the physical evidence that could tie any of this back to Dexter. In the meta-story, it erases the uncomfortable fact that a competent, relentless sergeant actually put the pieces together. Every drum of gasoline, every collapsing beam is a kind of narrative bleach. By the time the fire's out, the bodies are charred, the tools are warped, and the chain of custody is smoke. And crucially, Dexter does not light the match. Lila does. Her obsession with Morgan, her need to fold herself into his darkness, gives the writers a perfect scapegoat. We are going to see this pattern again and again. Someone else steps in to do the thing Dexter cannot be allowed to do on screen without shattering the illusion that he is different from the monsters he kills. Technically, his hands stay clean. Practically, his world keeps killing for him. Lila's instability is not just a character trait, it is a structural tool. When you lay them all out together, her arson, her stalking, her kidnapping of Aster and Cody later in the season, you start to see how the series uses her as a lightning rod. All the wild, chaotic energy that would make Dexter feel too much like the Zodiac, impulsive, theatrical, openly destructive, gets outsourced to her. She can blow up a crime scene. He can merely fail to stop her. Back at Miami Metro, the fire gives everyone exactly what they need: a dead suspect, physical remnants that can be made to fit the existing theory, a stack of blood slides in Doakes' car that, in hindsight, feel almost too perfect, and yet no one wants to tug on that thread. The abrasive sergeant with a history of violence dies in smoke, the kind that hangs over an unsolved case file for decades. If Dexter Morgan is protected by writers, the Zodiac is protected by uncertainty. By the way, a face can almost come into focus and then slip away again. We are going to sit with those almosts for a moment. The early investigation circled local men who seemed to fit: a school teacher with a strange sense of humor, a reclusive mechanic, a neighbor who liked guns too much, and people too little. Later, the public imagination latched onto bigger, louder candidates, from a bombastic newspaper cartoonist to fringe theorists, pointing at distant relatives and long-dead drifters. Each one looked promising in isolation. When you lay them all out together, you start to see a pattern of near misses instead of a single, clean answer. Witnesses gave the police a man who was both specific and vague: stocky, glasses, a round face, light-colored hair, a composite sketch that, depending on the angle and the newspaper print quality, could resemble half the middle-aged men in Northern California at the time. Patrol officers even spoke briefly with a man they later believed might have been the Zodiac walking away from a crime scene. The description was detailed enough to haunt them, but not detailed enough to close the distance between a memory on a foggy street and a name on a driver's license. The tools of the era pushed the investigation forward, but only so far. Handwriting experts compared the taunting letters to suspect samples and came back with language that sounds eerily familiar if you watch a lot of true crime. Highly suggestive, strongly consistent, not conclusive. Ballistics linked several shootings to the same weapon type, yet no gun ever materialized in a way that could survive court. Fingerprints, partial prints, boot impressions, even the stamps on envelopes created lines of inquiry that looked like they might converge. They never quite did. Again and again, a suspect would rise to the surface. Search warrants, interviews, quiet surveillance. Families would feel that chill of almost knowing, of being sure that the person at their dinner table or in their family photo albums was about to be unmasked on the evening news. Then the test would come back, or an alibi would hold, or a key witness would hesitate, and the file would slide back into limbo. Not cleared in a satisfying way, just not provable. This is the story of investigators living in the gray. No fall guy, no neat confession, no plastic-wrapped certainty. Now, set that beside Doakes. In the Bay Harbor Butcher case, the series chooses one man, builds a direct pipeline of planted evidence to his name, then obliterates the crime scene that could have contradicted it. Miami Metro homicide gets closure. Dexter gets to keep his mask, and you get the illusion of a solved mystery that real Zodiac, the newspaper's mistake, was the real offense. Every line is doing two things at once, proving authorship and inflating his own importance. Those letters force an entire city into a relationship with him. Police, editors, readers, all pulled into this ongoing correspondence that turns investigation into performance. Front pages become part crime bulletin, part stage. Detectives are not just chasing a suspect. They are reacting to a writer who sets deadlines, sends ciphers, threatens school buses. The case stops being purely about physical evidence at a scene and becomes about decoding a persona that insists on being seen. Dexter Morgan is the opposite pressure. His rituals are private, almost aggressively so. The plastic, the photos, the careful layout of the kill room are not a message to the world. They are a closed circuit between Dexter and the person on the table, with Harry's code hovering over every decision. The only audience is himself, and the ghost of a foster father who told him that the worst thing that could happen would be exposure. He does not mail trophies to Miami Metro homicide. He hides them in a wooden box behind an air conditioner. He does not demand headlines. He reads them to make sure his name does not appear. This is the story of a man who experiences recognition as a threat, not a reward. And that choice matters, because every Zodiac letter is also a new artifact, fresh handwriting to compare, fresh paper to analyze, fresh patterns in syntax and spelling. Every cipher is another structure that can be broken, another chance for a slip. Seeking fame is not just a personality quirk. It is an investigative advantage handed to the police. Pattern interrupt for a moment. If Dexter started faxing kill room photos to local news, would we still talk about him as some untouchable ghost? Or would we immediately understand that the risk profile has changed so much that the comparison collapses? That is why measuring who is better at not getting caught without accounting for motive is like comparing two different sports. One player is trying to stay off the field entirely. The other keeps running to the camera. In the next section, we're going to look at how time and technology widen that gap even further. So when we move into season 3, the question of motive and visibility stops being theoretical and starts sitting across from Dexter at dinner. Miguel Prado is not a faceless threat or a blurry suspect sketch. He is a celebrated Miami prosecutor, a man who walks confidently through metro homicide, shakes every hand in the room, and then looks at Dexter Morgan with something far more dangerous than suspicion: admiration. Miguel sees Dexter's calm, clinical presence at crime scenes and reads it, arguing that bad can be defined by his ambition, his grudges, his ego. Every time Dexter bends to keep the friendship, the mask slips a little, not in front of Miami Metro, but in front of someone who has the power and the platform to expose him if that bond fractures. And Miguel is unpredictable. He lies about following the code. He hides his own kill. He escalates. Suddenly, Dexter is not just cleaning up the city. He is cleaning up after his own student. The danger is no longer a bloodslide left behind, or a security camera he forgot to notice. The danger is a human being who knows the table is real, knows the knives are real, knows Dexter Morgan is not a metaphor. So Dexter does something that feels almost like a legal strategy. He turns on Miguel, stages the death as the work of the Skinner, and folds the entire arc back into a narrative Miami Metro can accept. A tragic fall of a crusading prosecutor. A tidy ending that simultaneously satisfies the story and erases a witness who could have named him. When you lay them all out together, Miguel looks very different from the people who hovered around the Zodiac case. Informants, tipsters, letter writers who claimed secret knowledge rarely had verifiable, actionable truth. Miguel does. He has proximity, detail, and proof. That is why this season feels like such a pressure cooker. The threat is not a cold file or a cipher in a newspaper. It is a friend at your table, learning your patterns, rehearsing your lines, and waiting for his turn to speak. And the next time someone like that gets close, the tools they have at their disposal will make Miguel look almost gentle by comparison. The danger does not just sit in evidence lockers or on Miguel's desk. It eats dinner at Dexter's table. It sleeps in the next room over. If Miguel is a threat because he studies Morgan's patterns from the outside, Rita and the kids are a different kind of threat entirely. They live inside the alibi. On paper, Dexter's life with Rita is perfect camouflage. The gentle boyfriend who helps a single mother rebuild. The man who brings groceries, fixes things around the house, stands in the backyard grilling while the kids run through sprinklers. In a world like Miami Metro homicide, where everyone sees the worst of humanity every day, that image becomes a kind of social armor. To suspect him would not just be a professional leap. It would feel almost rude. But that is the illusion, because every domestic scene is also a potential crime scene in waiting. When you lay them all out together, you start to see how often the mask almost slips in the most ordinary rooms in the house. The late nights where Dexter returns from a kill and Rita clocks the time. The unexplained cuts and bruises he brushes off as work accidents. The way his eyes go distant in the middle of a conversation, like he has stepped out of the life she thinks they share. Blood slides. A family outing cut short by a work call that is really a kill. The tension comes not from big reveals, but from how casually disaster keeps walking past the camera. Now, contrast that with the Zodiac. investigators could only speculate about what kind of home he returned to after his letters. A wife, a roommate, no one at all. There are no scenes of someone folding his shirts, asking why he is late, wondering about a stain on the car seat. Zodiac's personal life is a blank. Dexter's is a crowded frame. And that is why, as we move forward, the fault lines in Morgan's family life will become far more dangerous than any anonymous cipher ever could. And in that crowded frame, Season 4 gives us a reflection, not a cipher in a newspaper, but a man in a cardigan. Arthur Mitchell, the Trinity Killer, walks into the story as if someone aged Dexter Morgan 20 or 30 years and let the double life grow roots. A church deacon, a husband, a father, a man who builds houses for charity, and beneath it, a ritual of death honed over decades. On paper, he is what Dexter tells himself he wants to become. An older predator who has threaded violence through a domestic routine so carefully that no one in his family, no one in his community, suspects a thing. This is the story of what happens when Morgan finally meets the future he thinks he is working toward and realizes it can look disturbingly ordinary. Because when you lay them all out together, Trinity's cycles of killing, his road trips, his hidden trophies, they echo Dexter's patterns with an unnerving precision. Dexter does not just hunt Arthur. He studies him. He shadows him at church, follows him on the road, inserts himself into the Mitchell household as Kyle Butler. Every moment he spends at Arthur's dinner table is another crack in his own mask, another risk that someone at Miami Metro Homicide will notice how often the blood guy is suddenly unavailable. We are going to watch him take the kind of chances he used to mock other killers for staying close long after the practical need has passed, because he wants to understand how Arthur keeps it all going. At the same time, the series brings back a very different kind of threat. Special Agent Frank Lundy returns, older, slower, but just as methodical. His focus has narrowed to Trinity, a case that has haunted him the way the Zodiac haunted entire task forces. Lundy moves through Miami with that quiet, federal-level scrutiny, building timelines, cross-referencing rituals, lecturing about patterns in a way that feels almost old-fashioned compared to the flash of modern CSI, but no less dangerous. And now, let's pay attention to where those lines cross. Dexter is tailing Arthur to a build site. At the same time, Lundy is mapping out decades of similar murders. Dexter is sneaking into hotels, and yet, while the Bay Harbor butcher file gathers dust, Dexter is still walking those same hallways at Miami Metro Homicide, still stepping over the same thin blue line between analyst and suspect. That line is nowhere thinner than at the crime scene itself, where his day job and his night work quietly collide. This is the story of a man who does not just avoid evidence, he edits it, not with dramatic gestures, but with tiny, almost polite corrections that steer an entire investigation by a few crucial degrees. When you lay them all out together, you start to see how much of Dexter's safety depends on that soft voice at the perimeter tape, saying, "No, it didn't happen like that." Think about the ice truck killer scenes in Season 1. Dexter arrives, looks at the dismembered bodies, and finds patterns that are really messages meant only for him. Out loud to colleagues, he frames it as artistry, as a killer who is taunting the department. Inside, he is decoding a private conversation. By suggesting motive and style in a way that sounds purely analytical, he pushes everyone toward a narrative that keeps his own connection invisible. We are going to see this again with the Bay Harbor butcher case. When the task force studies the dumped bags, Dexter is the one who explains the precision of the cuts, the consistency of the disposal sites, the probable access to police databases. He is, in effect, describing himself. But because it comes from the brilliant blood spatter guy, it reads as objective truth rather than a confession disguised as theory. The same reputation gives him cover when he needs to do something less elegant. In Season 2, at the marina, he quietly wipes down his boat and removes potential trace evidence just before the investigation closes in. Later, in New Blood, he contaminates and redirects attention around Matt Caldwell's disappearance, nudging police toward the idea of a reckless rich kid on the run. These are not grand heists. They are small, practiced interferences. A slide removed, a swab not taken, a suggestion made at exactly the right moment. But that is where the fantasy starts to show. Real forensic labs operate with multiple technicians, peer review, chain of custody logs, and audits. One analyst does not simply pocket a key sample over and over again without patterns emerging in the paperwork. Reports are checked, methods are compared, and any consistent anomaly becomes its own kind of evidence. Now, let's hold that next to the Zodiac scenes. In late 1960s California, evidence was processed under pressure, with evolving standards and limited technology. But there was no Dexter Morgan standing inside the lab, subtly sabotaging the work, comparing his handgun to thousands of test fires in seconds instead of one tired examiner leafing through card files by hand. When you lay them all out together, you start to see how different the hunt would look. Even the old evidence, if it survived, would be invited back into the light. The stamps he licked, the envelopes he sealed, the bloody clothing he claimed as trophies. In the original case, those were mostly visual artifacts, things you photographed and filed. In a modern lab, they become potential profiles, microscopic skin cells, partial DNA mixtures, a genetic fingerprint that can be pushed into systems like CODIS, or used for familial searching. Nothing about that is guaranteed, but the menu of possibilities is wider, and colder cases do come back to life that way. Then there is the geography of his crimes. In the late 1960s, a deserted turnout really could be deserted. Now, that same road might be bracketed by traffic cameras, automatic license plate readers, and cell towers quietly logging every phone that passes. You would not just have tire tracks and boot prints. You would have a ring of digital witnesses, a car that appears near multiple scenes, a phone that goes dark in the same pattern each time, a suspect pool that narrows itself before a detective ever has a hunch. His letters change too. In the original story, he could drop a taunt in a mailbox and vanish into the crowd. If he tried that today, the paper and ink would be only the beginning. Postal tracking data, surveillance in and around drop points, digital forensics, if he ever drafted on a computer or touched a public terminal, linguistic analysis at scale, comparing his phrasing to online posts, legal filings, even school essays. The performance of being Zodiac would leave a much longer trail. Now, let's be careful. Modern tools do not magically solve every homicide. But Dexter lives inside that environment, understands its blind spots from the inside, and shapes his mask accordingly. Zodiac never had to face that kind of scrutiny, and never had a forensic analyst quietly curating his own risk. Settle in. Get comfortable with that difference, because next we're going to look at how their motives collide with those worlds and why attention itself becomes a kind of evidence. Attention is what Dexter spends his life avoiding and what the Zodiac spends his life chasing. That difference becomes even sharper in Season 5, when a survivor walks into Dexter Morgan's orbit and refuses to stay a faceless victim. Lumen is a statistical anomaly inside this story. She is one of the only people in the entire series to see Dexter's kill ritual up close and live, not as a fleeting witness in a parking lot, not as a half-formed suspicion at Miami Metro homicide, but as someone standing under the plastic with him, knife in hand. Sharing a boring moment becomes dangerous, because now any detective connecting her to the Barrel Girl case has a living bridge back to Dexter's nocturnal life. This is the story of how witnesses do not have to testify in court to threaten you. They just have to exist. Layered on top of that is Jordan Chase, a self-help celebrity with a national audience, a recognizable face, and a personal brand built on control. When you lay them all out together, his radio shows, his seminars, his entourage, his money, you see how killing Jordan is nothing like killing a nameless predator in an alley. If anything goes wrong, the missing person posters are replaced by press conferences. The manhunt is televised. The scrutiny is automatic. So, when Dexter and Lumen stalk Jordan, they are effectively staging a private execution in the middle of a media spotlight. Compare that to Zodiac, who leaves survivors who are traumatized, misled by lighting and hoods, or simply never able to point to a specific man and say, him. No one like Lumen ever walks beside investigators with a clear image and a shared project of revenge. The investigation hits a ceiling because the living links are blurred, partial, or silent. Dexter's world, by contrast, keeps generating these sharp, articulate survivors and witnesses who could, at any moment, decide to speak. And in the next turn, we are going to see what happens when that impulse to speak comes not from a victim, but from someone who loves him. And that impulse to speak, to finally say what you have seen, lands in a very different place once we reach Season 6. Because now the language around violence is not just personal or procedural. It is sacred, apocalyptic, and loud enough to drown almost everything else out. This is the story of the Doomsday Killer arc, where Miami is turned into a moving sermon. Bodies posed as the 4 horsemen. A woman's torso used as the Whore of Babylon. Tableaus arranged on rooftops and in public spaces. Every scene a biblical diorama designed to send a message, rather than simply conceal a crime. Travis Marshall believes he is carrying out Professor Geller's prophetic plan, carving scripture into flesh and stone, turning homicide into a kind of performance art for the end of the world. And you start to see how that performance shapes the investigation. Miami Metro Homicide is suddenly reading Revelation, consulting theologians, arguing over prophecy and symbolism. Is this about judgment or warning or conversion? The question shifts from who had access to this victim to what does this mean? And that is a very convenient shift if you're a quiet predator sitting 2 desks away. Every moment spent decoding a painting or a passage, the hunt narrows around this imagined fanatic, not around the possibility that someone calm, methodical, and professionally trained in blood like Dexter could be shaping the end of the story. Now, let's hold that up against the Zodiac for a moment. Zodiac also wrapped himself in symbols, astrological signs, cryptic ciphers, taunting letters, sent to newspapers. He wanted prophecy without theology, mystery without meaning. Investigators in San Francisco were dragged into the same interpretive maze, parsing codes and threats while more grounded leads went stale. Settle in, get comfortable with that contrast, because it shows how spectacle can hide the simplest truth. The most dangerous person in the room is often the one who looks like he belongs there. And inside Miami Metro Homicide, no one embodies that idea more than Maria Laguerta. On paper, she is part of the spectacle too. The political climber, the captain who worries about press conferences and promotion boards. But when you lay them all out together, the small choices she makes around the Bay Harbor butcher case, you start to see something else. A slow, stubborn refusal to let the simplest truth stay buried. It begins with a tiny object that should not exist. In Season 7, LaGuerta finds a single blood slide at a fresh crime scene, the kind of trophy the Bay Harbor butcher was supposed to have taken to his grave along with Sergeant Doakes. The official story says the slides burned with Doakes in that cabin. The slide in her hand says the story is wrong. That is the moment she quietly reopens the case. Not with a grand announcement, but with a private doubt. From there, we are going to watch her work the way real investigators do when they are not being watched. She goes back into the old files. She studies patterns of victims, disposal sites, boat access, the forensic neatness of every scene. She notices who at Miami Metro had the skills, the access, the proximity. Dexter Morgan, the friendly analyst who processed almost every major case, keeps appearing in the margins. It is not a single smoking gun. It is accumulation, weight, the feeling that the mask is a little too perfect. So she starts testing him, calmly, politely, as if nothing has changed. She asks Dexter about the slide, about Doakes, about why certain evidence looks cleaner than it should. She pulls his old Bay Harbor reports, then forgets to tell him she has done it. She has him followed. She has his boat checked again. Each move is a small trap, a staged scenario, designed to make Morgan slip, to provoke one revealing mistake. And you can feel Dexter sensing it, adjusting, improvising lies that sound reasonable until you hold them next to each other. The shipping container is where all of that quiet work surfaces. LaGuerta arranges a controlled situation. Suspects, something much larger than one life or one secret, dies. The scene is cramped and quiet, but it feels enormous. Deborah's gun hand is shaking. Her breathing is ragged. And outside, you hear the distant pop of fireworks, Miami celebrating the new year, while inside, its justice system quietly shoots itself in the heart. We are going to stay in that moment for a second, because when you lay them all out together, this is one of the purest expressions of what the series is really saying about institutions. Deborah is split down the middle. The brother she loves, the mentor who believed in her, the captain who has finally followed the evidence where it actually leads. The sound design keeps cutting between the muffled party outside and the suffocating stillness inside, as if the whole city is choosing not to hear what is happening in its own house. On the surface, Deborah pulls the trigger to save Dexter Morgan. But symbolically, she pulls the trigger on the truth. She has, right in front of her, the person in Miami Metro Homicide most committed to seeing clearly, the one who refused to let the Bay Harbor butcher file gather dust, and she kills her. The system does not just miss the truth here, it actively removes it, because the truth is too painful, too disruptive, too incompatible with the comforting story of who Dexter is supposed to be. That is the quiet irony. The detective who prides herself on being blunt, on cutting through lies, chooses the familiar lie over the unbearable fact. As a sworn officer, Deborah is meant to be the line between personal feeling and public duty. Instead, she becomes the proof that the line can be erased from the inside. The person tasked with upholding the law destroys its cleanest shot at understanding what has been living inside its own lab for years. And when you start to see it that way, Deborah's choice becomes a kind of dark mirror to the real Zodiac investigation. Out in Northern California, detectives and reporters faced pressure, career risk, and political interference. They had bosses worried about panic, jurisdictions guarding their turf, and a killer who seemed to enjoy making them look slow. But almost none of them faced a single cinematic instant where they had to literally decide, gun in hand, whether to execute the person holding the truth. Dexter survives this night, not just because he is meticulous, or because Harry's code is clever. He survives because someone who loves him more than she loves the institution chooses to look away, to fire in the wrong direction, to protect the mask instead of the evidence. And once you accept that, you have to ask a harder question. If a fictional killer is carried this far by loyalty and denial, they hit dead ends, watched promising suspects dissolve under scrutiny, felt careers slowly bend around a case that refused to close. The frustration is real. The ego bruises are real. But those pressures almost never translated into an active cover-up for a specific suspect. No one was planting blood-slides on a convenient scapegoat. No one was burning down a cabin to erase the truth. Instead, the real obstruction is quieter. Institutional inertia, budget cuts, new mayors, new chiefs, new priorities. A task force is hot for a season. Then the headlines move on, and so do the resources. Files are boxed, evidence rooms are reorganized, and the urgency that once kept everyone on edge slowly decays into a kind of procedural fatigue. This is not love, it is entropy. And here is the pattern interrupt. In all the years of Zodiac coverage, no one ever stood in a room and chose to save his life at the cost of justice. There is no Dexter Morgan moment, no trembling hand between the killer and the institution. He survives instead in the spaces between people and departments, in the gaps between one county's jurisdiction and another's, in the misfiled report and the phone call that never quite gets returned. That is the story of most real investigations that fail. Not a grand operatic act of protection, but a slow, impersonal drift away from clarity. So, when we are going to compare Dexter to someone like Zodiac, we have to keep this in mind. Dexter's survival is uniquely personal and emotional. His mask stays on because specific people choose over and over to keep it there. The next step is to look at what happens when that personal protection meets a system that is finally ready to see him. That system finally ready to see him does not arrive as a brilliant detective or a perfect piece of forensics. It arrives as an older woman sitting in Dexter Morgan's kitchen, calmly telling him she helped design the way his mind works. Dr. Evelyn Vogel reframes the entire story of Harry's code. She is not just another confidant. She is a self-declared architect, someone who knew what Dexter was long before Miami Metro homicide ever did. With Vogel, the circle of people who understand, or almost understand, gets wider. She has files, home videos, a professional vocabulary for the thing Harry could only call a dark passenger. She watches Dexter kill on camera. She knows his rituals, his plastic, his careful staging, and every moment she spends in his orbit is another line of potential exposure. Because unlike Harry, she does not live in his head. She lives in the real world, with neighbors, with colleagues, with a son. That son, Oliver Saxon, is where the mask really starts to fray. Saxon is not a themed killer with elaborate tableau. He is blunt, opportunistic, and angry. A man who will stab a victim. The department that once protected Dexter through habit and familiarity becomes a place of audits, budget pressures, and leadership changes. Quinn resents, Batista worries, Masuka is distracted. Internal politics make everyone a little more guarded, a little less willing to accept the friendly expert at face value. External scrutiny over the Bay Harbor butcher legacy and mounting unsolved cases turns the building itself into a kind of pressure cooker. And yet, when you lay them all out together, the series still swerves away from the most public version of accountability. There is no televised trial, no courtroom breakdown, where Dexter explains the code to a jury. Instead, this is the story of a man who simply erases himself. A staged death in a storm, a new life in the quiet, anonymous cold. The system has finally cracked enough to make his old life impossible, but not enough to actually put him under the same relentless historical spotlight that someone like Zodiac occupies. That final dodge sets up the last comparison we're going to make. So, Dexter's boat disappears into the hurricane. The wreckage washes up, and the series tells you a simple, comforting story. The monster is gone. The storm did what Miami Metro, what Homicide, what every near miss across 8 seasons could not do. Then the camera cuts, the music shifts, and we are going to a logging camp in the middle of nowhere, where a bearded man in flannel looks up. That cut is not an accident. It is a deliberate narrative choice to pull Morgan out of Miami without ever placing him in a courtroom, a prison cell, or a morgue drawer with a tag on his toe. He stages his own death, walks away from every file with his name on it, and the story quietly colludes with him. The Bay Harbor butcher case stays technically closed. The paperwork says, "Lost at sea." The reality is, a man stacking lumber, keeping his head down, and pretending the storm finished what it never actually started. In that ending, Dexter is still out there. He is not a ghost or a legend. He is an exile. He clocks in. He eats alone. He lives in a small, controlled pattern that looks like punishment but functions as concealment. You start to see how carefully the series arranges this. No active manhunt. No updated bolos. No task force in a war room. He is dangerous, but he is no longer being looked for. The mask is gone, but so is the spotlight. Now, let's put that beside Zodiac. There is no single storm, no clean break, no final shot of a man who got away. There is a cluster of murders, letters, ciphers, and then a slow, unnerving fade. The phone stops ringing. The envelopes stop arriving at newspapers. Detectives retire, evidence ages, and the case file thickens without ever closing. This is not a planned exit. It is a historical evaporation. When you lay them all out together, the contrast gets sharper. It's a reveal. Settle in, get comfortable, because that gap between written exit and unsolved mystery is where the comparison really falls apart next. That gap becomes even clearer when we move from Miami's neon to Iron Lake's snow. Dexter does not disappear into some abstract wilderness. He chooses a town where every face is familiar, where a new person at the diner is an event, and where silence carries farther across frozen air than across any crowded city street. On paper, Iron Lake should be perfect. New name, Jim Lindsay. No Miami Metro homicide. No blood spatter. No boat. Just a man who sells hunting gear, jogs through the woods, and keeps his cabin meticulously orderly. The mask is quieter now, but that is not the whole story. Because the smaller the town, the more every routine becomes a pattern, and the more any deviation hums in the background like static you cannot quite tune out. We're going to watch that static grow the moment Harrison walks back into his life. His son is a living reminder of the Bay Harbor butcher, of Rita, of the blood and abandonment that shaped both of them. Dexter's carefully controlled mornings and empty nights start to fray as old instincts resurface, checking exits, probing for lies, reading people the way he used to read crime scenes. The past is no longer a memory. It is sitting at his kitchen table. Iron Lake law enforcement feels smaller too, but not weaker. Angela Bishop does not have a full forensics lab or a task force, yet she has something else. Time to notice. A missing deer here, a suspicious gunshot there. Dexter always seeming to be around when something is just slightly off. At first, it is almost comically minor, the kind of thing you could wave away as coincidence. Then, it is not minor anymore. When you lay them all out together, the missing animals, the strange trespassers, the runaway kids, you start to see how a small jurisdiction can actually tighten the net faster. There are fewer files, fewer names, fewer places for a pattern to hide. But there are also friendships, romantic ties, shared history. Angela's trust in Jim, her bond with Harrison, her connection to people who vouch for him, all pull in the opposite direction of the evidence she is quietly collecting. This is the story of proximity cutting both ways. In Iron Lake, Dexter cannot vanish into a crowd because there is no crowd. Every lie has to be maintained face to face, over coffee, over dinner, over years. Compare that to Zodiac, writing letters across counties, leaving bodies in one jurisdiction and taunts in another, buffered by bureaucracy and distance. An anonymous figure in a car can drift between San Francisco and Vallejo. Jim Lindsay, Caldwell's disappearance. The uneasy way Dexter reacts to Kurt, you start to see how Angela's world begins to tilt. Unlike the detectives chasing the Zodiac, Angela does not have to wait for a letter to arrive. She has Wi-Fi, databases, and a browser window she can open in the middle of the night when something won't let her sleep. She starts with missing person reports, cross-referencing Iron Lake with wider state and federal notices. A name from a podcast, a face that matches an old photo, a pattern of young women vanishing around wealthy men. The lines on her evidence board are not cinematic. They are hyperlinks and PDFs. The digital trail is where Dexter's Miami life finally bleeds into his Iron Lake mask. Angela searches his supposed accident, finds an obituary that feels too neat, notices that a forensics specialist from Miami Metro homicide just vanished after the Bay Harbor butcher case closed. This is the story of a cop who can type Dexter Morgan into a search bar and suddenly see news clippings, FBI briefings, and a vigilante killer whose profile overlaps a little too perfectly with the man in her bed. When she finds the Bay Harbor butcher, the whole narrative shifts. A blood expert at Miami Metro, a boat, a string of executed killers who were never brought to trial, a sudden death at sea, and a convenient suspect in Sergeant Doakes. For Lagerta, Those overlaps were a source of torment and doubt. For Angela, they are data points. She does not remember Dexter bringing donuts. She never leaned on him in the lab. That lack of emotional history is her quiet superpower. Where Deborah recoiled from what the evidence said about her brother, Angela follows each lead without flinching, even when it makes her own choices look naive. She prints articles, listens to true crime episodes, and keeps going. No letters to newspapers, no coded ciphers, just a woman, a laptop, and the willingness to believe the worst about someone she only thought she knew. And in that, she becomes the kind of investigator Zodiac never really met, equipped with modern tools, unburdened by loyalty, and patient enough to push through every doubt until the Bay Harbor butcher is not a legend, but a man sitting across from her, running out of places to hide. Now, settle in, get comfortable, because once Angela forces Dexter to confront that history, the next step is seeing how quickly his carefully managed code turns into pure, panicked damage control. When Angela finally sits Dexter down with the evidence, the temperature in the room drops, not because she raises her voice, but because, for the first time in the entire series, someone calmly narrates his life back to him in a way he cannot reframe. She has the screws, the ketamine, the pattern of missing men. She has the connection to Miami, the Bay Harbor butcher files, the photos, the timelines officially tied to the word murder. For years, he floated just outside the paperwork. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses died. Narrative coincidence intervened. The Bay Harbor butcher investigation burned hot and then was redirected. LaGuerta's suspicions got buried under a shootout and a body on a boat. Every close call, every near miss, every time the mask almost came off, some combination of luck, loyalty, and narrative timing kept him in the shadows. But here, in Iron Lake, there is no grand conspiracy to save him. There is just a small-town chief who reads reports, compares dates, and refuses to look away. We're going to watch decades of evasion collapse into something almost mundane. A straightforward, evidence-based case, a warrant, a cell, a paper trail that will exist whether he talks his way out of the room or not. And this is where the Zodiac comparison bends. Because when you lay them all out together, every file on Dexter and every file on the real Zodiac, you notice the absence on one side. The Zodiac killer's name was never written on an arrest form. His fingerprints were never definitively matched. No officer ever stood in front of him and read him his rights while a camera captured the exact angle of his jaw for a mugshot that could be reprinted in textbooks. In that narrow, chilling sense, the Zodiac still occupies a space Dexter never reaches. If we define winning as never feeling steel on your wrists, never sitting in the back of a cruiser, never hearing your life summarized in charges and statutes, then Dexter loses the one game Zodiac wins simply by remaining a rumor with a body count. Now, let's stay with that idea, because the next step is seeing why that apparent victory for Zodiac is not the triumph it first appears to be. Because that victory depends on what each man is actually playing for. Dexter Morgan and the Zodiac killer are not competing in the same game, and once you look at their psychology side by side, you start to see how different the stakes really are. Dexter is a controlled psychopath, but he is not self-made. Harry's code is poured into him like wet concrete over rebar, shaping where the violence is allowed to flow and where it must never spill. Every kill is ritualized. The plastic, the photos, the careful confirmation of guilt, the blood slide. This is the story of someone who turns compulsion into procedure, who builds a private courtroom in every abandoned building and shipping container he enters. His need is not for headlines, it is for equilibrium. Dexter talks about the dark passenger the way other people talk about chronic pain. It is always there, humming beneath the mask he wears at Miami Metro Homicide, demanding to be fed or risk more deaths. Where Dexter's voiceover stays trapped in his own head, Zodiac tries to turn his inner monologue into front-page copy, and that choice matters. Seeking fame inherently drags you toward exposure, while seeking obscurity keeps pulling you back into the dark. One man spends a series and a revival season trying to make sure no one ever says his name in connection with a crime. The other writes his own name, or at least his chosen one, over and over, trusting that the era's investigative gaps will protect him from the very attention he craves. Here is the pattern. Interrupt. We know Dexter because the camera follows him home, into therapy sessions, into flashbacks of blood and moonlight, and Harry's lectures. We hear the justifications he whispers to himself. With Zodiac, we have fragments, police reports, inconsistent letters, possible hoaxes. So, when we are going to compare motives or skill, we are really comparing a fully illuminated interior world to a handful of shadows. Settle in. Get comfortable with that imbalance, because next we need to look at how the worlds around them either sharpen or dull the consequences of those choices. And this is where the gap really opens up, because once you stop looking at motives in the abstract and start looking at rules on the ground, you start to see that Dexter Morgan is playing a completely different game from the Zodiac. Harry's code is not just a vague kill bad people mantra. It is a layered, practical system designed by a cop who has seen every way an investigation can bloom from nothing. Surveillance comes first. Dexter watches his targets for weeks, sometimes months. He confirms patterns, confirms that they will kill again, confirms they fit the profile. In the story of Miami Metro Homicide, he is the one person in the room who never acts on a hunch. He acts on a file he has quietly built in the dark. That slow gathering of proof does two things at once. It lowers the chance of killing an innocent, and it lowers the chance of stepping into a trap. Harry bakes both into the same rule. No confirmed pattern, no table, no risk. It is a moral framework, if you want it to be. But operationally, it's a checklist, and the checklist catches mistakes before they exist. Wrong car, wrong house, unaccounted for security camera. The code is there to stop Dexter 3 steps before the moment where Zodiac would already be pulling a trigger. Cleanup is the same way. Plastic sheeting, drains, tools, disposal routes, alibis tied to his day job at Miami Metro. Every kill room is a preemptive cross-examination. If a detective stood here tomorrow, what would they see? What would they swab? What would they photograph? Dexter's answer has to be nothing, or the kill does not happen. Now, place that next to Zodiac. The victim choices feel. No real killer, Zodiac included, ever had a veteran cop quietly designing a survival manual just for them. And that engineered advantage is why, in this comparison, Dexter's world feels rigged in his favor before the first body ever hits the plastic. Because the next problem is even bigger than rules, the systems hunting them, and the decades of forensic evolution separating Miami from 1960s California. Once you move from rules to systems, the gap between Dexter and Zodiac stops being philosophical and starts being structural. Dexter Morgan lives in a world where danger is designed. Zodiac moved through a world where danger was discovered too late, if at all. Television writers are the quiet investigators in Dexter's life. Season after season, they walk him right up to the edge of exposure, then stop him 1 inch before the drop. He leaves a blood slide in his air conditioner. He forgets a tranquilizer syringe in his car. He lets Miguel Prado into his ritual. Every moment looks like the one that should finally tear off the mask. But the script bends. Evidence is destroyed. A body is misplaced. A witness dies at exactly the right time, because the series has to go on. This is the story of suspense with a safety net. The writers of Dexter are not trying to simulate a truly random investigation. They are balancing tension against longevity. They want you to feel that Miami Metro homicide is closing in, that the line is about to snap, while knowing internally that Morgan cannot actually be arrested in season 2 or 3 or even 7, because the narrative architecture depends on his freedom. The danger is real enough to feel, but not real enough to end the show. And we are going to be honest about our role in that. As viewers, we become accomplices. We want Dexter to survive. We want him to keep killing people who deserve it, even when the body count and the collateral damage make that justification thinner every season. When you lay them all out together, every time we exhale in relief as he escapes Doakes or Lundy or LaGuerta, you start to see how audience desire quietly pressures the story away from permanent consequences. Zodiac never had that kind of protection. The witnesses who saw him, the patrol officers who spoke to him near the crime scenes, the detectives who read his letters, none of them were guarding a protagonist's longevity. They wanted him caught. They wanted the story to end. But they were working with fallible memories, limited forensic tools, and the slow machinery of 1960s bureaucracy rather than a writer's room. Eyewitnesses misjudged his age and weight. Composite sketches blurred over time. Media coverage turned the case into a spectacle, amplifying fear while also drowning investigators in hoaxes and false leads. Reports were misfiled. Jurisdictions failed to share information. And this is the story of a man who does not avoid risk so much as surf on top of it, season after season. We are going to start with the big ones, the moments the series itself frames as existential threats. Doakes' cabin is the clearest. A decorated sergeant from Miami Metro homicide tailing Dexter, finding the blood slides, literally imprisoning him in a remote kill site. LaGuerta's long, slow investigation that begins as a doubt about the Bay Harbor butcher and ends with her reconstructing Dexter's marina habits, his connection to Doakes, his proximity to every key crime scene. Deborah walking into that church and seeing her brother with a knife, mid-kill, the blood still warm. Angela in Iron Lake quietly running his name, connecting the Bay Harbor butcher to the pattern in her own files, and then finding the screws from his kill table in the ashes of his cabin. But those are just the peaks. Beneath them, you start to see the constant, low-level tremor of risk. Masuka raising an eyebrow at Dexter's odd hours. Quinn following up on the Kyle Butler alias. Colleagues noticing how often Morgan happens to be at or near the most important scenes. Rita hearing Paul insist that Dexter framed him, then literally holding the shoe that proves it. Each moment, taken alone, is survivable. Together, they form something closer to a case file, Conceptually, there are at least 4 independent lines of danger converging on him at all times. There is physical evidence, blood slides, boat records, security cameras, cell phone pings, the plastic and tools that keep appearing and disappearing around his life. There are witnesses, Doakes, LaGuerta, Deborah, Miguel, Lumen, Hannah, Angela, even Harrison. There are emotional ruptures, the breakdowns where Dexter's affect goes flat at a crime scene, or too bright at a funeral. And then there is pure chance. The neighbor walking a dog near a dump site. The patrol car that almost stops the trunk from being driven out of Miami. In a real department, when you lay them all out together like that, something different happens. Patterns of proximity, recurring anomalies in one analyst's schedule. The same name adjacent to multiple internal tragedies. Those are exactly the kinds of things that trigger quiet audits, outside reviews, or at least an unflattering memo. The system does not need one genius. It needs a spreadsheet and time. Instead, Dexter survives because the story bends. Colleagues accept wild coincidences. Supervisors overlook conflicts of interest. People who love him are given just enough plausible doubt to look away. His record as an uncaught killer is not a demonstration that he would have baffled the real-world machinery that never... Early DNA work from stamps and envelopes does not tie him in. The case tilts toward him, then away, not with a dramatic reveal, but with a quiet, bureaucratic shrug. There is the moment when a patrol officer may have actually encountered Zodiac on the street near a crime scene, received a mistaken description over the radio, and let him pass. A tiny miscommunication, a single bad detail. In a Dexter episode, that officer would glance back, notice something off, and the whole season would pivot on that split second. In San Francisco, it becomes a footnote in a report that will be misfiled, then rediscovered, then debated for decades. Around those moments, you can feel the lost opportunities piling up. Clothing preserved, but not in ways that anticipate future DNA techniques. Fingerprints lifted, but smudged, partial, or later questioned. Evidence that might have carried microscopic skin cells is handled without the kind of care Miami Metro homicide would take for granted in Dexter's world, simply because no one in 1969 could imagine the test that would exist 50 years later. Let's sit with that for a second. The science to catch him may have been invented, but the raw material for that science quietly decayed in storage. Leads fade the same way. Witnesses move away, die, or simply lose the sharp edges of memory. A face that once seemed unmistakable becomes a blur. Detectives retire, and with them goes the informal web of hunches, side notes, and half-remembered conversations that never made it into official files. Time becomes its own kind of accomplice, sanding down every hard corner until nothing quite fits together anymore. And this is where the contrast with Dexter Morgan becomes clearest. Dexter's story is built on a chain of dramatic, last-minute escapes. Doakes in the cabin, LaGuerta at the shipping container, Deborah on the dock. Every close call, every near miss, every time the mask almost comes off, the series pauses and shows you the knife edge. Zodiac has almost none of that. He does not sprint out of back doors as sirens close in. He does not improvise speeches to suspicious colleagues. He simply remains undefined. If you imagined the Zodiac investigation as a TV series, many seasons would not end with a killer slipping through a police cordon. They would end with a cardboard box being pushed a little farther back on a shelf. a detective turning off the light, a file number typed incorrectly, quiet, unresolved scenes in police basements, where the real cliffhanger is whether anyone will ever open that box again. Those quiet basements and misfiled numbers give us one kind of protection. The killer disappears into the chaos. Dexter Morgan survives inside something else. He is wrapped in people, in stories, in needs that bend reality just enough to keep donuts in the briefing room. All become a kind of mirror. People project onto him what they are missing. LaGuerta sees a diligent analyst who makes her clearance rates look better. Masuka sees a colleague who laughs at his jokes. Harrison, later, sees the father he lost. The mask is not just something Dexter puts on. It is something the whole series keeps polishing for him. And around that personal web, there is the larger comfort of institutions choosing the easier story. Miami Metro does not want the Bay Harbor butcher to be a friendly blood guy with a boat. They want him to be a dead special ops cop in a burnt cabin. Iron Lake does not want a serial predator embedded in its quiet routines. It wants a tragic accident on the ice, a missing girl who probably just left town. Over and over, homicide units accept conclusions that tidy their paperwork and soothe their politics. Timing steps in as the final accomplice. The blood slides in Dexter's air conditioner appear just in time to frame Doakes. Lila arrives at the cabin a few hours before anyone else and turns a potential crime scene into ashes. In New Blood, the podcaster Molly dies just before her archive of suspicions can be aired, and Kurt's trophies are found only after they serve Dexter's narrative. Doors close a second before someone walks through them. Evidence is destroyed a moment before it can be logged. Now, let's pull those threads together. Love that hesitates, masks that invite projection, institutions that prefer convenient myths, and timing that borders on cosmic choreography. We are going to see that this web of protection is emotionally satisfying, almost cozy to watch. But beside the Zodiac files, beside that cold indifference where no one is secretly rooting for the killer, it stops looking like fate and starts looking like narrative armor. Once you strip that narrative armor away, you start to see the machinery underneath. Not the killers, but the institutions. This is the story of how entire systems can look straight at a predator and still manage to see whatever is most convenient, most comfortable, or most politically useful instead. In Miami Metro Homicide, that looks like confirmation bias with a badge. Once the blood slides show up in Doakes' car, once the cabin explodes, the Bay Harbor butcher case becomes a solved story on paper. The abrasive sergeant with a temper fits the template, so everyone relaxes into that answer. When LaGuerta later finds inconsistencies, when new evidence and old instincts tell her that Morgan never quite added up, the room does not lean forward. The room leans away. To reopen the case is to admit they celebrated the wrong funeral and closed the file on the wrong man. We are going to sit with that for a moment, because it is not just about pride. The result is almost the inverse of Dexter's world. In the Zodiac case, systemic failure creates a fog where no single suspect is ever fully visible. In the series, that same kind of failure becomes a spotlight that keeps sliding away from one very specific man. Dexter stands at the center of Miami Metro's information flow. He processes the blood, steers the narrative, anticipates the paperwork. Institutional blindness does not just miss him by accident. It is repeatedly bent, nudged, and reinforced in his favor. And that is where our fascination starts to feel less cozy, because beneath the calm framing and the tidy seasons, there is an anxiety you can't quite shake. If this many near misses can cluster around one fictional analyst, how many real monsters are slipping between agencies, beneath budgets, behind outdated systems right now? Settle in, get comfortable, because the next step is to look at what happens when that blindness finally cracks and who pays the price when it does. So if the blindness finally cracks and someone like the Zodiac steps into view, what happens then? In the neat fantasy version, this is where Dexter Morgan boards a plane, sharpens the knives, and the crossover event writes itself. But if we are going to stay inside Dexter's universe and inside Harry's code, that fantasy starts to fall apart almost immediately. The first obstacle is simple. The code is not, "I think he did it." The code is certainty. Dexter needs current, verifiable proof, a body he can tie to a suspect, forensic evidence he can test at Miami Metro, a pattern he can confirm on his own terms. With Zodiac, even in the real historical record, we do not have that. We have at least 5 confirmed murders, a cloud of possible others, disputed attacks, copycats, hoaxes, and a name that was never officially matched to a face. When you lay them all out together, you start to see the problem. Harry trains Dexter to close the gap between suspicion and proof. He stalks, he tests, he recreates timelines. He pulls sealed files out of homicide archives. With a local predator, that works. With Zodiac, Dexter's staring at yellowed case files from another state, another decade, another investigative culture entirely. There is no fresh blood to analyze, no active crime scene to quietly contaminate, no way to run a quick DNA comparison in the lab after hours. And that leads to the second obstacle, geography. The code assumes Dexter's home field advantage. Miami is his ecosystem. He knows every canal, every alley, every blind spot in Metro's procedures. To hunt Zodiac, Dexter would have to travel across the country, into unfamiliar jurisdictions, without his usual access to evidence, or his trusted forensic mask. Suddenly, the quiet analyst is just another stranger, hanging around an old cold case, a vigilante who, for once, might have to walk away. And that, in its own way, is more unsettling than any imagined showdown. And if that quiet, unresolved ending feels strange, there's a reason. We are used to turning real killers into characters, and characters into benchmarks, until the line between them blurs so much that someone like Zodiac starts to feel like a dark mirror of Dexter Morgan instead of what he actually is, a mostly unsolved file full of gaps. Fiction does something very specific for someone like Dexter. It cleans him. It trims away every boring stakeout that went nowhere, every night where nothing happened, every moment where a real person would get sick, sloppy, or scared. The series only shows you the plastic, the careful tools, the perfect kill rooms. Hindsight is baked into the script. When you lay them all out together, every close call, every escape, you start to see how much of Dexter's competence is really narrative design, not human ability. Real people do not get that treatment. The Zodiac that exists in case files is not a ghost who never made a mistake. He is a man filtered through incomplete reports, lost evidence, and the investigative limits of the late 1960s. Witnesses misremember. Officers miscommunicate. Leads die with the people who held them. Errors happen all the time. They just do not get a spotlight episode devoted to them. In that sense, the messiness is not just Zodiac's. It belongs to the whole system around him. So when we say, almost casually, that Zodiac was like Dexter in real life, we are doing something subtle but powerful. We are taking Dexter's curated, writer-protected brilliance and laying it over a case where luck, jurisdictional friction, and outdated forensics mattered at least as much as any individual's skill. We inflate Zodiac into a mastermind by importing Dexter's mask, and we quietly push aside the possibility that a very ordinary person slipped through very ordinary cracks. There is another cost. Turning real violence into a contest of masterminds makes the victims recede into the background. Their lives flatten into set dressing for a debate about whether this killer was as smart as a fictional vigilante from Miami Metro homicide. The more we frame it that way, the more the actual suffering becomes a kind of atmospheric texture, something to give weight to a story instead of the story itself. If we separate these worlds more clearly, something healthier opens up. We're going to let Dexter stay what he is, a meticulously constructed narrative about control, compulsion, and the fantasy of targeting only those who deserve it. And we treat Zodiac as something else entirely, not a character, but a sobering case study in what happens when institutions fail, when technology lags, when randomness wins. Now, do a series of controlled near misses. A blood slide almost discovered, a boat almost searched, a colleague almost following the right hunch all the way to his front door. The mask trembles, but it never quite falls, at least not until the narrative is ready. This is the story of suspense you can revisit, a ritualized anxiety that resets at the start of the next episode. Zodiac never resets. There's no final reveal, no last kill room where everything is explained. There are traffic stops where an officer lets a man pass because the description did not quite match. There are witnesses who remember the glasses or the jacket, but not the plate number. There are ciphers that may or may not say anything at all. Instead of a tidy arc, you get a spreading stain of uncertainty that never really dries. When you lay them all out together, every close call in Dexter and every near miss in the Zodiac case, the thin line between catching and losing someone starts to look painfully small. A cop who stays late to recheck a file instead of going home. A dispatcher who mishears an address. A sister who pulls the trigger in a shipping container, or decides, for one more moment, to believe the brother she loves. The difference between exposure and escape lives in those tiny human pivots, and that is what these stories really reveal. Not superhuman predators, but fragile human systems trying to see through masks they helped create. Metro homicide politics that protect a friendly analyst. Overworked detectives in late 1960s California, without DNA, without databases, relying on memory and paper and luck. Fiction gives Dexter a structure that eventually forces the truth into the light. Reality lets Zodiac drift away into the gaps as we follow Dexter back into the safety of fiction. Let's keep that in mind before we look one more time at just how many chances the real world had and lost to stop someone like him. So when you lay them all out together, the lab access, the plastic, the near misses, the unsolved files, you start to see that Dexter versus the Zodiac is not really a contest at all. It is two different kinds of stories pretending for a moment to share the same frame. On one side, you have Dexter Morgan walking into Miami Metro homicide every morning with a keycard and a smile. He is the blood guy, He touches evidence. He shapes narratives. He knows where the blind spots in the system live because he helps maintain them. He has Harry's code as a ready-made operating manual, a set of rules written from inside the institution to exploit every weakness it has. And above all, he has narrative armor, a story that bends around him, that lets cars stall, witnesses hesitate unidentified. It was not because he was written to survive. It was because real-world policing is uneven. Evidence degrades. Witnesses misremember. And small bureaucratic decisions close off entire lines of inquiry. Dexter's long run as the uncaught Bay Harbor butcher is a function of writers managing tension. Zodiac's unresolved identity is a function of history, chance, and institutional imperfection. So, when we compare them like competing athletes, who is better, who would win, we miss the point. One is engineered to almost get caught again and again, so that you feel the tension. The other is a case that never quite closed, with real names and real graves attached to every gap in the file. We're going to ask you to hold both truths at once. Settle in, get comfortable with enjoying Dexter as suspenseful entertainment, as a carefully controlled nightmare you can turn off, while also keeping a quiet respect for the Zodiac's victims by not turning their killer into a charming TV anti-hero. Because once you start tracing every moment where the real investigation could have gone differently, the next comparison becomes much harder to watch in the same way. So now we slow down a little. We have spent a long time in the company of killers, both invented and historical. And even when you know you are safe in your own room, your body still keeps a quiet tally of every close call, every missing piece, every name that never quite arrives. This is the story of what happens after the adrenaline fades, when the questions stay, but the monsters start to blur at the edges. Settle in, get comfortable. Picture where you are right now. Maybe you are lying in the dark, the room around you reduced to outlines, with just the glow of a screen and the low murmur of a voice talking you through other people's nightmares. Somewhere in the background, there is the soft hum of a fan or traffic far away, or a refrigerator cycling on and off, and layered over it is this quiet, persistent story about people who almost saw the truth. When you lay them all out together, Dexter Morgan's days and nights at Miami Metro Homicide start to feel almost unreal in how close they come. The cheerful analyst walking into the bullpen with donuts. The same man, hours later, standing in a plastic-wrapped room with a knife, a slide, and someone begging. Season after season, the mask almost slips. Doakes, waiting outside the marina. La Guerta, tracing algae and boat slips. Rita holding the shoe that could have ended everything. Deborah, standing in a church with a gun and an impossible choice. Again and again, love, coincidence, or the invisible hand of the script reaches in and steadies the wobbling tower. The Zodiac case is not a tower. It is a scatter of jagged fragments on a cold table. A car at a lover's lane. A cab killer whose name becomes a television title. And a killer whose name never quite leaves the case file. And as we exhale with them, we're going to look at what it means to step back from that edge and leave the lights off on purpose. So, as we leave that edge in the dark, we also leave Miami for a moment. We move from the bright, humid streets where Dexter Morgan walks into Miami Metro Homicide every morning, to the foggy, winding roads of Northern California where the Zodiac once hunted and vanished. 2 coasts, 2 climates, two very different kinds of silence after a body is found. In Miami, the light is almost aggressive. Neon reflections on water, sirens cutting through the heat, lab fluorescence humming over Dexter's shoulder as he reads blood like a language. The city feels overexposed, every angle watched, every surface swabbed. Northern California in the late 60s is the opposite. Headlights on empty highways, lovers' lanes swallowed by darkness, a killer who can step back into the mist and then reappear in a newspaper headline. One world is built for surveillance. The other is built for disappearance. Time does its own kind of scene dressing. The late 60s are just beginning to learn the vocabulary of serial killers. Zodiac is not a trope yet. It is a new kind of fear, arriving in envelopes and ciphers and phone calls. There is no DNA database to quietly wait for a match, no digital trail to reconstruct a night. By the 2000s, when this series gives us Dexter, we are fluent in that fear. We talk about profiling, forensics, anti-heroes. We watch a blood spatter analyst moonlight as a vigilante and accept that as an almost logical extension of our obsession with evidence. But that is the point. When you lay them all out together, Dexter versus the Zodiac is less a fair fight and more a mirror. Not a contest of body counts or cleverness, but a reflection of what worries us in each era. In one, the terror that someone can kill and simply never be found. In the other, the anxiety that even with all our tools, someone like Dexter can stand inside the institution and bend it around his mask. You start to see that these stories are not really about ranking killers. They are lenses we hold up to the systems that promise to protect us. Dexter shows us the cracks from the inside, a Bay Harbor butcher hiding in the paperwork. Zodiac shows us the cracks from the outside, a taunting letter where an arrest report should have been. Same question, different angle. Where does the line fail? So, as we settle in, get comfortable with that comparison. We do not need harsh verdicts. We are going to let Miami's glare and Northern California's fog sit side by side and notice how each one makes a different kind of fear visible. This is the story of how our stick-wrapped kill rooms and open-air parking lots where the fog never quite lifts. This channel is meant to be that space where you can settle in, get comfortable, and let a complicated story unfold at a pace your mind can actually follow. Not a rush of clips and headlines, but a slow, late-night journey where, when you lay them all out together, you start to see patterns in how we talk about killers, justice, and the masks we put on them. If you feel like supporting that, you can. You do not have to. There is no urgency here. But if you want more of these quiet comparisons between a vigilante in a television series and a narcissistic predator in old case files, subscribing or leaving a like makes it easier to keep going. It tells the algorithm that there is room for this slower, softer kind of analysis. You can also leave a comment when you wake up or when you remember about which moment stayed with you. Maybe it was the distance between Dexter's meticulous code and Zodiac's chaotic need for attention. Maybe it was the reminder that Dexter always had writers to protect him, and Zodiac only had real detectives, real mistakes, and real consequences. Whatever it was, you can put it down there, in your own words. All of that support, in whatever form it takes, just makes it more possible to keep returning to these stories, to keep saying, this is the story of how fiction simplifies what real investigations can never quite resolve, to keep tracing the line between a character who always leaves some kind of order behind and a real killer who left only questions. From here, we are going to move toward a little more silence. You can turn off the light or let the next video autoplay and carry you a bit further. Either way, you are leaving with a slightly clearer sense of Dexter, of Zodiac, and of the distance between the world that can be rewritten and the one that never quite adds up. So now, as we let that distance settle, you can almost imagine the sound changing. The folders that have been open in your mind start to close one by one, the way case files get stacked at the end of a long shift. Somewhere in a quiet office, a desk lamp clicks off, and the glow on the last page of a report fades back into ordinary darkness. You start to see the hallway outside that office, the kind you have walked past in Miami Metro Homicide 100 times across the series. Only this one is empty. The bulletin boards are still covered in faces and timelines, but no one is standing there arguing about fibers or alibis. The clatter of keyboards and ringing phones has thinned out into an air conditioner hum, and the soft echo of your own footsteps, and even those are getting quieter as we are going to walk away from the details. Dexter Morgan's world never really has to live in that silence. When you lay them all out together, every season as tidy as a television script, but not every question has a clean answer, and not every line on a board has to connect to something. It is all right if some of these shapes stay soft around the edges, if some shadows stay in the corner instead of under the microscope. Because what really matters is not ranking monsters on a scoreboard. It is noticing the systems, the choices, and the blind spots that let them move as far as they do. Whether that is a blood spatter analyst walking unchallenged through Miami Metro, or a letter writer slipping past the limits of 1960s forensics. The names change, the jurisdictions change, but the patterns have a way of repeating until someone finally sees them. So, for now, let's leave the board on the wall and the files in their drawers. Settle in, get comfortable, and let the specifics blur, just enough that you can feel the weight of the story without having to hold every fact. The lights are going off in the squad room. The hallway is empty. You can let this one stay unsolved for a while. Out, beyond that empty hallway, the city has already slipped past midnight. Most windows are dark now, a scattered grid of blank squares against the sky, with only a few stubborn rectangles of light where someone else is still awake, still watching, still listening for footsteps that are not actually there. This is the hour when even a place like Miami or San Francisco in the Zodiac years feels like it has exhaled. The traffic thins, the sirens grow rare, and whatever hunts in the shadows seems to pause, as if the whole map of streets and alleys has agreed to be quiet for a while. The investigations, the codes, the blood spatter and crime scene tape, all of it recedes into filing cabinets and darkened offices until morning. And for you, it stays even further away. Because this is the story of danger at a distance, of Dexter Morgan and the Zodiac Killer turned into shapes on a screen, into names in a file that will never reach across the room. You are not in the Bay Harbor Butcher case file. You are not on any of Zodiac's taunting letters. You are just here, wrapped in blankets, or washed in the pale light of a phone or a television, watching other people walk those lines for you. When you lay them all out together, every close call in the series, every unsolved page of a real investigation, you start to see how much of this is about safely touching the edge of fear. We are going to trace it, think through it, compare codes and patterns and masks. And then we're going to put it back where it belongs, on the other side of the glass. So now, let's do something simpler. Take one slow breath in. Notice the way your own room sounds when you are actually listening. The hum of a fan, the distant